Good day. My name is Dennis Pitcher. I am the Chief Fintech Advisor to the Premier of Bermuda, and this presentation is really for local stakeholders within government, within local industry, to kind of talk about where we're going with Bermuda Fintech in 2020. We are releasing other videos and other presentations, and we'll be looking to do one for the general public, as well as for the wider fintech industry. So in this presentation, I'd like to talk about achieving economic growth for Bermuda through fintech. I'd like to start out with a bit of a story, and that's of the repair of the Hubble Space Telescope to make it operational, and what astronomer Bob Williams wanted to do in pointing it at a space in the sky filled with nothing. It was an incredibly powerful instrument, and he faced a lot of opposition to doing so because it could have wasted valuable resources. But as a result of him being able to have discretion, he pointed at that little red dot. And from that, it fundamentally changed our understanding of the universe because what we were able to see. And I tell this story that sometimes you really need to be willing to look for what you can't see to be able to realize what's possible. With that, I ask you to imagine if paying a bill was as easy as taking a picture, if sending money was as easy as sending an email, if loans were based upon data rather than profiles, and investment advice was tailored to fit you. Why isn't this happening in Bermuda? Why aren't we attractive to retail innovation? Things like Robinhood and Venmo and Stripe and Square, why aren't they available in Bermuda? And more importantly, how do we fix it? So I'd like to introduce to you our currency standard and innovation playground initiatives, because we need a plan of action to make ourselves attractive to innovators and to make innovation accessible to Bermudans. So what is a currency standard? Well, I like to ask, what if everyone had a money address and it made sending money as easy as sending an email? It would mean that money is connected instead of fragmented. When you think of the modern age of coronavirus and people working from home, where you have WebEx and you have Zoom and you have Google Meet and you have Skype, in order to talk to anyone, we have to have the same app. But when we look at email, I don't have to worry about whether or not you have Outlook or Gmail or Apple Mail. I just send a message to an address and I know it'll get there. So the question becomes, do you want your money to be connected like email or fragmented like chat? And like chat, do you want to have an app for every kind of money? When we look at the innovation that's happening around the digitization of value, there's many different implementations of digital dollars so far. When we look at other digital fiat, there's a lot of ripe innovation happening globally. When we look at the realm of cryptocurrencies, the inspiration for a lot of this experimentation that's happening in that realm, and then more broadly at the scope of value more generally, digital assets, the wrappers around value and how to make them more exchangeable and accessible for people. So like email, do you want to be able to choose whichever value matters to you and not have to think about what value someone else wants and have that be abstracted away? Or do you want to have to always transact in the same value? So we need an initiative to connect money, like email, and that digital money should just work no matter which money you choose, a currency standard. And with that, we can realize what's possible when money's connected. When you think about the complexity of modern banking, it's really difficult when you have to send a wire transfer of which bank details, which routing number, which address. It's actually quite complicated to make payments, logging into your bank account, figuring out which sections to go in, what the accounts are. It's difficult. So what happens if we can abstract that away and make it more like email, where you could really send money to an address? And because that's digital and then programmable, what happens when a business can actually say, well, if they have a payroll of an employee, could they really automate that? Where it becomes something as simple as they could say, I have to pay my employee $5,000. I can just put $5,000 into some code, and the code's going to figure out where those payments need to go and what the obligations are. So taking away some of those burdens of small business administration. And this kind of opens the realm where we can start to see where decisions can shift from people to code. and really be triggered by anything, whether it's rules around who it needs to go to, timing of when, driven based upon data sources, or even being auditable. And when we look at it, innovation actually drives job creation. You can think back to the introduction of the spreadsheet. Now, it's easy to get confused as to the spreadsheets that you know and understand today, these complex beasts of software. But when they were introduced, it's kind of like this one on the right here, VisiCalc. They were very, very simple tools. And what we saw were declines in the jobs of bookkeeping, manual intensive work with pen and paper, or pencil and paper. But at the same time, we saw growth in new job categories that were able to leverage those tools. And we actually saw more growth in new jobs versus declines in the paper-based jobs because of efficiency. So I like to actually point to traditional fintech to really tell the story of what's coming. If you look at a company like Square, and they're well known for creating this little payments dongle that you could plug into your phone to be able to take credit card payments. Well, they were able to use that to drive data insights into a small business, to know what the flows are into it, and then actually start lending at a micro amount of starting at $500. Because they had access to the data about a business, they were able to drive decisions based upon data instead of demographics. And that actually meant greater financial inclusion in the States for lending to women-operated businesses, as you see the green 58% from Square versus the 17% traditionally, and then 35% to minorities versus the 27% traditionally. And it's worth recognizing that that number actually is very representative of 35% of the actual demographics in the States. And when we look further to the future, what happens when any company could offer loans? Loans could be really offered as a service, when you can take that technological innovation and repackage it so that any business could tap into it. And it means that any business could then offer loans based upon data rather than profiles. And you have something like our local taxi booking app that has those data insights into whether a taxi operator is able to pay back money in the case that their transmission goes out and they need to have their taxi repaired. They have the best connectivity to the customer, and thus they can leverage these tools and then tap in traditional banking to be able to drive that if it's repackaged as a service. So the question is, why aren't we attracted to this kind of innovation? Why isn't it happening in Bermuda? Well, it really comes down to a factor that we're just really small. And when we look at it, innovation really requires an ecosystem. And Bermuda has some strengths and weaknesses. When we look specifically at our weaknesses, we really have gaps in terms of customers, talent, and fintech infrastructure. When you only have a population of 60,000 people, it's really difficult to have a lot of customers to build an innovative business on. But we could look and say, well, how did we fill these gaps with insurance? How did we get customers, talent, and reinsurance infrastructure? We solved these challenges and these gaps by targeting a global market. And really, Bermuda played a role in reinventing insurance. Bermuda became a leader in offering insurance to insurance companies, infrastructure services that could be sold to other markets around the world. And really, it's worth recognizing that our insurance industry started as an immature industry. And the industry and the regulator grew together. We went through whole classes of insurers getting wiped out before we finally reached the Solvency II equivalent standard that gave us equivalence with the EU and a similar standard that gave us equivalence with the US. We really graduated and grew as we went, as we really understood how to mitigate the risks. And when we look to digital money, the challenge is the global market for digital money just doesn't exist yet. But what if Bermuda was the first place that could demonstrate what digital currencies and digital assets could do? Bermuda would then become a showcase of digital asset innovation, a form of safe harbor for innovators who want to be regulatory compliant, which would lead to a new global market. Acting as a showcase would allow us to really sell and develop those core infrastructure products that we specialize in regulating. So how do we drive this innovation? Well, we really need to drive adoption of digital money and attract that core fintech infrastructure that's in its infancy so that we can use those and repackage them to help drive innovation. And when we look at it, we're very strong in regulations. But our strength is our challenge. When we look at our high regulatory standard, we started with a very high bar, contrary to what we did with insurance. And that high bar is a barrier to innovation because it's like this ladder. If there's no bottom rungs for innovators to learn on and climb on, they can't really meet that high standard that allows us to be in the top 6 of our CFATF assessment and other accolades. So we do have a graduated regulatory environment that allows you to develop your business model, demonstrate your policies and procedures of risk management, and then graduate into a full license where you can really operate your business without limits. But you have to bring your own customers. And I call this the Waymo problem, where Waymo, the Google self-driving car, is really restricted to testing in this small little area in California. And they get employees and guests to opt in, but the problem really becomes that the employees and guests move in and out of that zone. So it's really difficult to get real-world testing. And what happens is Google just sets these cars to drive around empty, simulating it. But if Google's a data company, don't they really care about the data insights of self-driving cars and how that's going to change society? Well, they can't really focus on the data insights until they've really got everything else working. And it's a really big challenge that only companies like Google can really manage. And Fintech has the same problem. But when we look at it, our weakness could be our strength. We're small, we're a contained ecosystem, and we have modern infrastructure. And this makes us the perfect model for larger jurisdictions. And Bermudians actually have a history of being early adopters. When we look at smartphones, Blackberries and Palm Trios were heavily adopted on island, as were iPhones and technology more generally. VPNs are big because we like our Netflix, and smartwatches are actually quite big here. So we actually do adopt tech if we see value in it. So the question is, for Bermudians, well, why do we need innovation? Well, if we're a model jurisdiction that drives innovation, that helps spur global demand for the kind of infrastructure services that we specialize in regulating, in the same way we have for insurance, then it can lead to growth that leads to jobs. So how do we drive that innovation? Well, we need to create an environment that allows us to lower barriers, manage the risks, and really showcase what's possible. An innovation playground of sorts, an environment that allows you to incubate it and develop and work with this kind of interoperability of money, this currency standard. So what does that innovation playground look like? Well, if we're able to get Bermudians and Bermudian businesses to opt in to using risk-controlled monies, then we're able to create an environment where innovators can really experiment and not have to deal with the full scope of complexity of regulations. And they can graduate from that into our more broad and well-structured regulatory regime, our sandbox and full license. And this involves creating a progressive ecosystem of digital dollars, where we can look at each tier and recognize that we can control some of the risks, whether it's incentive money, kind of like gift cards, where there's fairly low risk, innovation money, where we carefully control the risks, using Bermuda as a sandbox, kind of in the same way Bermuda dollars are only redeemable in Bermuda, and then embracing kind of global public money. And how do those tiers get structured? This allows someone with an idea, like Gmail for Money, to be able to work through these tiers to actually graduate their understanding of how to mitigate the risks and how to develop their policies and procedures, and really have an environment to say, you know what, I can validate my idea before I invest a lot in regulatory compliance, because we're all learning, we're all figuring out what works, and that's what we need to invest in, is iterating the right kind of solutions that people value. So, as an example, what would incentive money look like? Well, before the shelter in place, my colleague Gina would have paid to have her patio cleaned, and that money would have then been spent throughout the economy with this patio cleaner. However, after the shelter in place, my colleague, I asked her, what isn't she likely to spend on now that she's concerned about the economy and where it's going? And she said, well, she's no longer going to have her patio cleaned. So that patio cleaner, unfortunately, now is, through no fault of his or her own, looking to the government for support because this is kind of unexpected. However, with digital money, because we could put rules and controls around the money, we could actually control or incentivize spending where it's needed. So if we were to give Gina some extra money, some digital money, she would actually have to spend that within places like that patio cleaner where she would have spent it already and can't necessarily hoard it and just put it in a bank. But creating such an environment requires a keystone. And a keystone is a critical piece that holds a structure together. In this environment, the government is that keystone. And that's why back in October, we announced an initiative that the government would accept one-to-one, 100% reserved US dollars and Bermuda dollars, as we have local banking support, to be eligible for payment of government taxes, fees, and services. Because government acceptance really allows everyone else to accept it. So the question is, how do we start? Well, first we need to get money, digital money, in the hands of the people. And second, then we need to attract some of the core infrastructure that can help drive this innovation and adoption. So why do we need this innovation again? Well, if we're a model jurisdiction that can help drive innovation that leads to and spurs global demand for the very infrastructure companies that we're trying to attract and can help grow on island, then it helps lead to jobs in the same way it did with insurance. So as a recap, we need jobs and economic growth. We need to recreate the model used to build the insurance industry and really learn what's missing. We need a progressive environment that enables the fintech industry to mature. And we need to showcase Bermuda as a model jurisdiction to really attract the key players and innovators to come and work with Bermuda to drive global demand and act as a safe harbor. So the key question we want you to take away from this is, how can you use this technology to help us build this industry? What are the problems that you can solve with this and what I presented? So with that, I'd like to thank you for taking the time to view this introduction. And of course, we'll have more material coming out, but we'd welcome if you would get in touch with us to provide feedback and any questions of how you can help get involved in making this vision a reality. So thank you very much and have a good rest of the day.